Hello and welcome to the first video in a new series on orchestration concepts. This series is designed for beginning composers, orchestrators, or arrangers who may be interested in writing for large ensemble, whether that ensemble is made of real players or one that is digitally created. Today I'll be discussing the Harmonic Series, also known as the Overtone Series, as it relates to the basics of orchestration. To demonstrate, I'll be using orchestral sample libraries, as well as various music and audio applications. I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Let's get started. What is the Harmonic Series? The Harmonic Series, as it relates to music, is a sequence of frequencies or tones where each of those frequencies is an integer multiple of a fundamental frequency. Typically, a distinct musical pitch from an instrument is made up of many pure sine waves. So even though you may perceive that pitch as having one frequency, there are in fact many frequencies present at various amplitudes. If I play an open A on the violin, the fundamental frequency that we perceive as the pitch is the A in the treble clef staff. If I analyze all of the frequencies present in this pitch, I notice the fundamental, as well as all of these other frequencies above that fundamental. The fundamental frequency of that A is 440 Hz, and all of these additional frequencies are the harmonics located at integer multiples. Using an EQ filter plugin, I can isolate each partial, which on their own sound almost like a sine tone. That's because, for the most part, what makes a violin sound like a violin is the composition and individual amplitudes of these harmonics. One of the coolest things about playing a violin is that you can actually play harmonics by isolating the nodes of the harmonics along the string. If you divide the string in half, you can isolate the first overtone. It sounds an octave above the open string. If you divide the string into thirds, you isolate the second overtone. A violinist knows where these nodes are on each string and can typically access the first 3 to 5 harmonics. In general, the larger the string instrument, the easier it is to comfortably play these harmonics and to get them to sound consistently and strongly. A type of synthesis called additive synthesis involves adding pure sine tones to a fundamental frequency. Let's take a look at this simple patch that I built using the software MaxMSP. Here I set the fundamental frequency in Hertz, and here I set the amplitudes of the first 20 partials, that is, the fundamental frequency and the first 19 overtones. Down below, I have an object from MaxMSP called Spectroscope, which shows the frequencies of those partials on the x-axis and the amplitudes on the y-axis. Right now, I have the frequency set at 1 Hz, and so it's easy to see that the frequencies of the partials are integer multiples. As I change the fundamental frequency, the ratios of the frequencies of those partials remain the same. Let's find A440 again. All of these frequencies were present in the open A violin note from before. I'll now add each individual partial to the mix. After a while, our ears stop hearing these as separate notes. Something worth noting is that as I lower the fundamental, there is less room between the frequencies in this spectral display here. I'll discuss this more in just a bit. Here I've set the fundamental to A110 Hz and mapped that harmonic series on a notated staff. You can see that the frequencies of these harmonics don't perfectly align with our equal temperament tuning system. For example, the 7th partial in this series is close to our equal temperament G on the treble clef, but there's actually a 14 cycles per second difference. So why might this be important information to a composer or orchestrator? Well, besides the fact that it's useful to know all of this, there is an important principle on display here. Notice how the size of the intervals between adjacent notes of this series get incrementally smaller as you get higher in pitch. As you get higher in frequency, the difference in frequency between two successive notes gets larger and larger. For example, the difference between This first A, I'll call this A1, and the B just above it is 6.73 Hz. If I jump to A4 3 octaves above, the difference in frequency to a major second above that is 53.88 Hz. That's a significant difference, and our ears hear that difference, almost like there's more room up there. This is why having instruments play small intervals like seconds and thirds in an upper range sounds perfectly normal, while having instruments play the same interval several octaves lower sounds muddy. When voicing chords of an orchestra or in an orchestral section, we can use the harmonic series as a guideline for spacing notes. To achieve a balanced sound, you can roughly follow the same spacing as the harmonic series. This is of course just a guideline, but it's a good starting reference point. Let me demonstrate by orchestrating a few chords for the string section. This first example shows an A major chord where the basses have the lowest octave A, that's A1, and the rest of the strings have the notes of that A's overtone series. So the cellos have the A an octave above, the violas have the fifth above that, the second violins a fourth above that, and the firsts a major third above that. The overall sound is a bit dark because each instrument is playing in a lower part of their respective range, but to my ears it doesn't sound too muddy. I hate to use the word normal, but that's sort of what we get here. The next example builds upon the previous one, so we have the same 5 notes starting at the bottom, and then we continue adding the notes of the A major chord in closed position. Then to divvy up the notes, I divide each section, other than the basses, in half. Because the violins are now in a stronger range than the first example, the overall sound is stronger, but balanced from top to bottom. The next example purposefully does not use the harmonic series as a guide. Here I demonstrate small intervals between notes in the lower range and wider intervals in the upper range. The result doesn't sound horrible by any means, but to my ears it is unbalanced and a bit muddy. Notice also how you can almost hear the individual instruments clearly, as there is a wider gap between the low and high strings. The instruments don't blend as well, and unless I had a compelling aesthetic reason, I probably would avoid scoring this way. The next 2 examples show the same configuration of an F minor chord, first in the cellos and basses, and then in the violins. Notice how dark and ominous the first chord is, and how clear and delicate the violin chord is. It's the exact same chord, but because of where the notes are positioned, it sounds vastly different in each case. So what if we want to orchestrate a chord with more than 3 notes? The same principle can apply. This example demonstrates how I might space a 6-note chord in the strings. I use a similar spacing between notes with the large intervals in the basses, cellos, and violas, and a closed spacing in the violins. Because I stick with perfect and consonant intervals, that is octaves, sixths, fifths, fourths, and thirds, this 6-note chord sounds fairly consonant, at least to my ears. I could just as easily move the notes around and get a more gnarly sound, all while maintaining a spacing system based on the harmonic series, but that's for a future video. The next few examples show the same basic concept in the full orchestra. This happens to be a different 6-note chord. I stick with similar spacing for each section, with large intervals between the lowest notes in each section, and a few small intervals in the treble clef staff and above that staff. I want to point out that I have a fairly large interval between the top 2 notes and the next 2 notes, but I find that if you double the top notes up an octave, you can get away with it. It's sort of like doubling a melody up the octave. Let's listen to each section on their own. This next example is of a D-flat major triad scored for full orchestra. Again, same principles apply here, and the resulting sound is very full and bright, while still sounding balanced. I chose to use a shorter duration in the samples for variety. I'll play each section individually now. In the last example, I tried to score that same D-flat chord for full orchestra in a way that completely disregards the harmonic series. The results are what you'd expect, and even though the overall sound is interesting, it's not balanced and the low end is extremely muddy. That's not to say that there aren't times when this might be the right choice. It's all about finding the voicing or chord spacing that fits your desired aesthetic. So if you want a chord that sounds muddy or dark, or bright or terrifying, you know how to do that. Using the harmonic series as a guide for spacing is in a way similar to how you might first learn to compose using major or minor chords. You eventually learn how to go against the guidelines to achieve the sounds that you want. I hope that you've enjoyed this first tutorial in my Orchestral Fundamentals series. See you next time.